The August heat made the cotton bolls split early that year, and Thomas Garrett's head split too, severed clean at the third vertebra and mounted on a sharpened fence post where the main road crossed into Bellwood Plantation. His eyes were still open when the sun rose on August 14, 1863, staring back toward the white-columned house where his wife was packing trunks in darkness, hands shaking so badly she couldn't fasten the latches. The blood had stopped dripping by dawn, soaked into red Carolina clay that had drunk so much already it barely registered one more offering. What made travelers stop their wagons a quarter-mile out wasn't the sight itself. Public executions were common enough. But the silence. No authority had come to take it down. No militia rode in to restore order. The plantation bell that rang every morning at 5 hadn't rung in 3 days. Bellwood's 200 acres of cotton stood ready for harvest, and not a single white person remained on the property to claim it. Marlborough County, South Carolina, had never been rich like the low-country plantations near Charleston, but it had always been predictable. The land here was good for cotton if you worked it hard, and by 1863, hard work meant enslaved labor. Bellwood Plantation sat 7 miles south of Bennettsville, connected to town by a rutted road that turned to soup every spring and baked to concrete every summer. The property had been in the Garrett family since 1798, passed from father to son with the land and the people who worked it. Thomas Garrett wasn't born to the plantation. He married into it in 1857 when he wed Catherine Bellwood, the only daughter of a man who owned 43 people and 300 acres but had no sons to inherit them. Thomas came from modest Methodist stock in North Carolina, a carpenter's son who'd learned surveying and earned a reputation for efficiency. Catherine's father, dying of consumption, saw in Thomas a practical manager who wouldn't drink away the profits or gamble the land. The old man was right. Thomas Garrett was nothing if not efficient. The enslaved population at Bellwood had numbered 43 when Thomas arrived. By the summer of 1863, it had grown to 68. Not through purchases. The war made that difficult. But through births that Thomas tracked in a leather-bound ledger with the same precision he used for cotton yields and equipment depreciation. He recorded each child's parentage, date of birth, and projected value at maturity. The ledger sat on his desk in the overseer's house, a smaller structure 200 yards from the main residence where Catherine lived with their 2 daughters. Thomas had taken the overseer role himself rather than hire someone, a decision that surprised neighboring planters but made economic sense. Why pay another man's salary when you could live on the property and maximize control? He moved into the overseer's house 6 months after the wedding, telling Catherine it was temporary, just until they got the place running smoothly. 6 years later, he was still there, visiting the main house for Sunday dinners and major holidays, but sleeping each night within earshot of the quarters, a rifle propped beside his bed. The people who worked Bellwood's fields knew Thomas Garrett's efficiency intimately. He calculated that an adult field hand could pick 150 pounds of cotton per day during peak season. Anyone who came up short lost a portion of their food ration, measured by the pound. He determined that 12 hours of labor was optimal. Longer and productivity dropped from exhaustion. Shorter and you wasted daylight. He instituted a system of bells, one at 5 a.m. for waking, one at 6 for field departure, one at noon for 30 minutes of rest, one at 6 p.m. for return, one at 9 p.m. for sleep. The bells ruled everything, and Thomas Garrett stood behind them with a whip he called the Encourager, and used frequently enough that most people on the property bore scars in a diagonal pattern across their shoulders. But Thomas didn't consider himself cruel. He considered himself practical. He never struck anyone in anger. That would be inefficient, prone to error and excess. Instead, he punished violations of his system with the same cold calculation he applied to everything else. 3 lashes for arriving late to the fields, 5 for talking during work hours, 10 for any perceived insolence. He kept records of these punishments too, noting them in the margins of his ledger next to each person's name. 68 people, 68 columns of notations. Some columns ran 2 pages long. The war had complicated Thomas's system without fundamentally changing it. Confederate conscription took younger white men from neighboring farms, but Thomas was 34 with a wife and children, exempt from service. Cotton prices had risen dramatically. The Confederacy needed every bale for European trade, which should have meant prosperity. Instead, it meant pressure. Thomas drove his workforce harder in the summer of 1863 than ever before, extending the 12-hour days to 14, then 16. The mathematics were simple. More hours meant more cotton, meant more profit, meant vindication of his methods. What Thomas didn't calculate was the cost of exhaustion measured in something other than pounds per day. By early August, people were collapsing in the fields. Her name was Dinah, and she'd been born on Bellwood 33 years earlier, which meant she'd known 3 overseers before Thomas Garrett arrived. The first 2 had been brutal in the casual, unthinking way of men who considered violence a simple tool. They'd strike you for looking wrong, for moving too slow, for reasons they'd forget by nightfall. Thomas was different. Thomas remembered everything. Dinah worked the main cotton fields with her 15-year-old son, Marcus, and her mother, an elderly woman named Parthena, who could no longer keep pace but still came to the fields each morning because Thomas docked rations for anyone who stayed behind without a documented fever. The 3 of them had developed a quiet system. Dinah and Marcus would work their rows quickly, then double back to help Parthena with hers, making up the deficit before the midday bell. It had worked for 2 years, but in the brutal heat of August 1863, even their combined effort wasn't enough. August 10th. Parthena collapsed at 11:15 a.m. She simply folded, her basket spilling cotton onto the red dirt. Dinah ran to her, Marcus following, and they found the old woman conscious but unable to stand. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Dinah called for water, but the water boy had been sent to another field. She called for help carrying her mother to shade, but Thomas Garrett appeared before anyone could move. He stood over Parthena with his ledger, already open to her page. 63 pounds yesterday, he said. 58 the day before, she's declining. She needs rest, Dinah said. Just today. She'll work tomorrow. Thomas consulted his notes. She rested twice in July. Productivity dropped 11% on those days. She's dying, Marcus said, his voice cracking with youth and anger. Thomas looked at the boy with the same expression he used when reviewing equipment, assessing utility, calculating replacement cost. Then he closed the ledger. Get her to the shade by the quarter bell. If she can't work tomorrow, dock both your rations by half until the deficit is recovered. He walked away. Dinah and Marcus carried Parthena to the tree line and laid her on ground that offered no comfort. She died that evening, just after the return bell, while the quarters filled with people too exhausted to properly mourn her. The next morning, Thomas noted her death in the ledger. Parthena, age unknown, estimated 65. Productivity decline accelerated final month, natural causes. Then he adjusted the field assignments. redistributing Parthena's row among the remaining workers. Dinah had sung while she worked for as long as anyone could remember. Old songs her grandmother taught her. Hymns from the brush arbor services held in secret. Wordless melodies that carried over the fields and marked the rhythm of planting and picking. The day after Parthena died, Dinah stopped singing. The silence was more noticeable than any sound had ever been. People in the quarters began meeting in whispers. Thomas Garrett kept 2 records. The first was his official ledger, the one he'd shown Catherine's father and occasionally shared with visitors who admired his systematic approach to plantation management. It contained names, ages, productivity metrics, disciplinary notes, a clean accounting of human beings as economic units. The second record was a collection of letters he wrote but never sent, stored in a locked drawer of his desk. He'd started the practice in 1859, shortly after Catherine had complained about the sounds drifting from the quarters at night. Crying, singing, the murmur of conversations in a language she didn't understand and found unsettling. Thomas had promised to maintain better order, but something in her complaint had needled him. That evening, he'd written the first letter. "My dear cousin James," it began, addressed to a man who actually existed, a minister in Raleigh who'd once suggested Thomas was too severe in his methods. The letter laid out Thomas's philosophy in detail, that enslaved people were like children who required firm guidance. That sentiment was the enemy of proper management, that Catherine and other plantation wives didn't understand the necessity of discipline because they never had to impose it themselves. The letter ran 4 pages. Thomas never mailed it, but he felt better having written it. Over the next 4 years, he wrote 37 more. Some addressed to his cousin, others to his late father-in-law, a few to no one in particular, just to whom it may concern. They documented his thinking on breeding policies, optimal punishment ratios, the correct response to malingering and theft. They defended decisions that no one had questioned, but that Thomas felt compelled to justify. In an 1862 letter, he'd written, "Severity is mercy's twin when applied with reason. The lash that corrects today prevents the rope that would hang tomorrow." He kept them locked away because even Thomas understood, on some level, that the philosophy they contained would disturb most readers. But he reread them sometimes, late at night, finding comfort in his own logic. On August 11, 1863, the day after Parthena died, someone broke into the overseer's house while Thomas was in the fields. They used a pry bar on the desk drawer, splintering the wood. They took the letters, all 37, and left the official ledger untouched. They also took 3 things from Thomas's bedroom: his rifle, his pistol, and a hunting knife with a 9-inch blade that he'd inherited from his father. Thomas discovered the theft when he returned at dusk. He stood in his violated office for several minutes, calculating. The guns represented approximately $40 in replacement value. The letters represented something harder to quantify, evidence of thinking that even he recognized as potentially damaging if shared with authorities or neighbors. He should have reported the theft immediately. Instead, he locked the door, walked to the main house, and told Catherine nothing had happened. That night, while Catherine slept, he sat at her father's old desk and tried to remember exactly what he'd written in those letters. His memory was excellent for numbers, less reliable for prose. He recalled phrases: necessary severity, systematic, application of correction, the moral duty of maintaining order. But had he written anything that could be used against him? Had he described specific incidents in ways that might sound, to an unsympathetic ear, like confessions? The questions kept him awake until the 5 a.m. bell rang across the plantation, calling the living to another day of labor. The dead, as always, were excused. Bellwood Plantation shared its western border with the Hutchins property, a smaller holding of 80 acres worked by 23 enslaved people. Robert Hutchins was 52, a widower who'd known the Bellwood family for 30 years. He'd attended Catherine's wedding to Thomas Garrett, brought a silver serving tray as a gift, and made polite conversation about the importance of finding a man who understood modern agricultural methods. By 1863, Robert Hutchins had visited Bellwood exactly twice since the wedding, once for Catherine's father's funeral, once to return a borrowed plow. Both times he'd noticed things that troubled him in ways he chose not to articulate. The silence in the quarters, the way people moved with mechanical precision, no wasted motion, no conversation. The scars visible on arms and backs when people bent to their work. He'd seen plantations run strictly before. His own was no paradise. But something about Bellwood felt different, felt wrong. During the second visit, in June of 1862, Robert had tried to speak with Catherine about her husband's methods. They'd been standing on the main house porch, drinking iced tea, watching Thomas in the distance walking between cotton rows with his ledger and his whip. "He's very thorough," Robert had said carefully. "Father chose him for exactly that quality," Catherine replied. "The plantation is more profitable now than it's ever been." "Profit is important," Robert agreed. "But so is moderation." Catherine had looked at him sharply. "Are you suggesting my husband is immoderate?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes a lighter hand achieves the same results with less friction." "Thomas doesn't believe in friction," Catherine said. "He believes in systems. Everything here runs like clockwork because he's eliminated inefficiency." She'd set down her tea glass with a click. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Hutchins, but I assure you it's misplaced." Robert had left shortly after, and he hadn't returned. But he heard things. Marlborough County was small enough that news traveled, especially news about the enslaved population. People from Bellwood sometimes encountered people from Hutchins's property at the creek that served as a boundary between the holdings. Stories were shared in whispers, passed along in coded language. Robert heard that Thomas Garrett had instituted a system where children as young as 7 were put to work in the fields. He heard about the ration reductions, the extended hours, the punishments recorded in careful columns. He heard about Parthena's death on August 11th, the day after it happened. One of his workers, a man named Solomon, had a cousin in Bellwood's quarters. Solomon came to Robert that evening, hat literally in hands, and asked permission to attend a burial service. "When did she die?" Robert asked. "Yesterday evening, sir. She was old. She just couldn't keep working." Something in Solomon's voice made Robert look up from the farm accounts he'd been reviewing. Couldn't keep working or wasn't allowed to stop? Solomon said nothing, which was answer enough. Robert granted the permission, and Solomon left for Bellwood at dusk. He returned after midnight, and though Robert was already in bed, he heard Solomon moving through the quarters, heard voices rising and falling in conversation that went on until nearly dawn. The next morning, Solomon worked his usual tasks without comment. But Robert noticed that several of his workers kept glancing toward Bellwood's boundary, toward the line of trees that separated the properties. That afternoon, August 12th, Robert did something he'd been avoiding for over a year. He rode into Bennettsville and found Sheriff William Tatum in his office behind the courthouse. Tatum was 60, a man who'd held the position for 16 years and considered himself a reasonable administrator of order. Robert had known him socially for decades. "Bill," Robert said, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk. "I want to talk to you about Thomas Garrett." Tatum set down the papers he'd been reading. "What about him? Have you heard any complaints? Any concerns about how he runs Bellwood?" The sheriff's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. "Concerns from whom?" "From anyone." "Robert, you know I can't act on vague concerns. If you have specific knowledge of a crime—" "An elderly woman died yesterday because she was worked past exhaustion. That's specific enough?" Tatum sighed. "Was she enslaved?" "You know she was." "Then it's not a crime. It might be poor management, but it's not illegal." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "Look, I understand you don't like Thomas's methods. A few others have mentioned it too. But he's operating within his rights as property owner. Unless he's breaking Confederate law or creating a public disturbance, what if he's creating conditions that might lead to a disturbance?" The question hung in the office air. Tatum studied Robert for a long moment. "Are you telling me you've heard plans for an insurrection?" "No. I'm telling you that when you push people hard enough, something breaks. And I'm worried about what happens when it does." Tatum reached for a piece of paper, dipped his pen in ink. "Give me specifics. Names, dates, incidents I can verify. If there's genuine cause for concern, I'll look into it." Robert tried. He described what Solomon had told him, what he'd observed during his visits, the stories that circulated through the county's enslaved population. But as he spoke, he could see Tatum's interest waning. Everything Robert said was secondhand, unverifiable, and, even if true, not clearly illegal. Managing enslaved people was the owner's prerogative. The law protected Thomas Garrett far more thoroughly than it would ever protect anyone working Bellwood's fields. After 20 minutes, Robert stopped talking. Tatum set down his pen. "I appreciate you coming in," the sheriff said. "I'll keep your concerns in mind. But unless something more concrete develops, there's not much I can do." Robert rode home as the sun set, knowing he'd done exactly enough to ease his conscience and exactly nothing to change what was happening on the plantation next to his. 2 days later, when Thomas Garrett's head appeared on that pike, Sheriff Tatum would remember this conversation and wonder if he should have listened more carefully. But by then, listening wouldn't matter. Bellwood Plantation had a chapel, a modest structure built in 1846, when Catherine's father had undergone a brief period of religious enthusiasm. It sat at the eastern edge of the property, a white-painted building with 8 pews, a simple altar, and a cross carved from pine. For years, a Methodist circuit rider had stopped there monthly to conduct services, attended by the White family, and in theory, by any enslaved people who wished to hear the gospel preached. In practice, attendance had been mandatory under Catherine's father and became forbidden under Thomas Garrett. Thomas considered religion a waste of labor hours and a source of dangerous ideas about equality before God. The chapel had stood unused since 1858, its door locked, its windows shuttered. Dust accumulated on the pews. Mice nested in the organ bellows. The building became a storage space for broken equipment that Thomas intended to repair eventually. Tools with cracked handles, a wagon wheel missing spokes, coils of rope too frayed for field use. No one noticed when the lock was picked sometime in late July of 1863. No one noticed when 3 people began meeting there after the 9 p.m. bell, when darkness covered the plantation, and Thomas Garrett slept in his overseer's house with his stolen rifle no longer beside his bed. The three were Dinah, her son Marcus, and a man named Samuel, who worked the farthest fields and rarely spoke but listened to everything. Samuel was 41, born in Virginia and sold south at age 23, old enough to remember the failed Nat Turner Rebellion and wise enough to understand why it had failed. Too visible, too early, too confident in righteous anger without sufficient planning. They met in the chapel because it was the last place anyone would look for them, and they brought the stolen weapons, Thomas's rifle, his pistol, the hunting knife, hidden beneath old canvas and coils of rope. But they didn't meet to plan an insurrection. Not exactly. "We can't kill them all," Samuel said during the first meeting, speaking the truth that any enslaved person with sense understood. "Even if we got the overseer and the mistress, they'd hang every one of us, every man, woman, and child. You know that. So we do nothing." Marcus's voice was sharp with youth and fresh grief. "We let him work us to death like he worked my grandmother?" "I didn't say nothing," Samuel replied. "I said not that." Dinah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She'd stopped singing, but she hadn't stopped thinking. "What if it wasn't all of us?" she said finally. "What if it was just some?" The two men looked at her. "They can't hang everyone if only a few are responsible," she continued. "They'd need to know who did it, and if they can't know—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "If the overseer dies and we're all in the fields, all together, witnesses for each other—" "They'll still suspect us," Marcus interrupted. "Suspicion isn't proof," Samuel said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "Not if we're smart about it. Not if we make it look like something else." They talked for an hour that first night, not planning violence but discussing possibilities. What if Thomas had an accident? What if he fell from his horse, struck his head on a rock, drowned in the creek? What if it looked like robbery, like someone passing through had killed him for his valuables? But accidents were hard to arrange convincingly, and robbery wouldn't explain why nothing else on the plantation was taken. They talked through scenarios, finding problems with each. The meetings continued, 3 times in the final weeks of July, twice in the first week of August. They were careful, never more than 3 people, never in the same place 2 nights running. After the chapel, they met in the tobacco barn, then in a equipment shed. Other people knew about the meetings without being told explicitly. Information traveled through the quarters in ways that bypassed words. A glance, a pause in conversation, the absence of someone from their cabin after the 9 p.m. bell. People noticed Marcus carrying something wrapped in cloth. They noticed Dinah's new quiet intensity, the way she watched Thomas Garrett with the focused attention of someone studying an enemy. What would you do knowing what was being discussed? Would you join the meetings, knowing the risk? Would you report what you suspected, hoping for mercy? Or would you do what most of Bellwood's enslaved population did? Maintain careful ignorance, go about your work, and wait to see what the 3 in the chapel decided. The decision came on August 12th, the day after Robert Hutchins visited Sheriff Tatum, though neither conversation had anything to do with the other. That evening, after the 9 p.m. bell, Dinah and Marcus and Samuel met in the equipment shed for the last time. "It has to be public," Dinah said. "If he just disappears, they'll search, they'll question, they'll assume someone ran and bring in dogs, militia." "So we make a statement," Samuel said. "We make them afraid," Marcus added. They discussed for 2 hours, not whether they'd already crossed that line in their minds, though none had said it explicitly until now. They discussed how, when, and what would come after. They discussed which people in the quarters could be trusted absolutely, which might be problems, which would simply look away. They discussed escape routes, though all three understood that true escape wasn't possible. They were choosing something else, choosing to break the system even if breaking it meant breaking themselves in the process. By the time they finished, the August 13th dawn was less than 5 hours away. Samuel went to the chapel and retrieved the rifle, the pistol, and the knife. Marcus went to the quarters and quietly woke 7 specific men, spoke 3 sentences to each, and returned to his cabin before anyone could ask questions. Dinah sat alone in the darkness and tried to remember the sound of her mother's voice. The songs Parthena had sung when Dinah was young, before the years had stolen everything, including breath. Then she stopped trying to remember and started planning exactly where to place the pike, so everyone on the road would see it from a quarter-mile away. Thomas Garrett woke at 4:50 a.m., 10 minutes before the bell, as he did every morning. He believed in discipline, starting with oneself. How could he demand precision from his workforce if he didn't model it? He dressed by lamplight in his standard overseer's clothing: canvas trousers, cotton shirt, leather vest with pockets for his notebook and pencil. He reached for his rifle, remembered it was gone, and felt a flash of irritation. He'd need to ride to Bennettsville soon and purchase a replacement, perhaps file a theft report with Sheriff Tatum, though that would require explaining why he'd waited 3 days to report it. He walked to the bell post and rang the 5 a.m. call. The sound carried across the plantation, sharp and insistent. Windows lit in the quarters, doors opened. People emerged into pre-dawn darkness and moved toward the fields with the automaticity of 6 years' conditioning. Thomas conducted a quick count as workers assembled. 67 present, 68 minus Parthena. Satisfactory. He noted that Dinah and Marcus were present, along with Samuel and the others he'd privately categorized as potential problems, all accounted for. He checked his pocket watch. 5:07, 3 minutes past optimal assembly time. He'd note it in the ledger, see if a pattern was developing. The workers moved into the cotton fields as the sun rose, painting the horizon red. August was peak harvest season. The cotton had to be picked before September rains, which meant maximum hours. Thomas had calculated they needed 12 more days of intensive labor to finish this section. Then they'd move to the western fields. The mathematics were tight, but achievable if everyone maintained. Productivity? Thomas spent the morning walking between rows, observing, noting. He saw that Marcus was working fast, too fast, picking with an aggression that was inefficient because it led to mistakes, bowls torn and damaged. Thomas made a note. Marcus, aggressive but inaccurate. Counsel on technique. He saw that Dinah was working steadily but mechanically, her face expressionless. He'd noticed she'd stopped singing. Perhaps that was maturity, a recognition that sentiment interfered with productivity. Perhaps it was grief for her mother. Either way, her output remained acceptable. At noon, the bell rang for the 30-minute rest period. Workers moved to the shade at the field's edge where water buckets waited. Thomas retreated to a small covered structure he'd built specifically for midday record-keeping. A roof on posts, open sides, a desk and chair. He sat and opened his ledger, began transferring observations from his pocket notebook to the permanent record. He was focused on his writing when Samuel approached, hat in hands. "Sir, there's a problem with the equipment wagon." Thomas looked up. "What kind of problem?" "Axle looks cracked. West field. Thought you should see before we tried to move it." Thomas calculated. The west field was a quarter-mile away, out of sight from the main work area. If the wagon broke down completely, they'd need it repaired before they could start Western harvest. Better to assess it now than face delays later. He closed the ledger, stood, and followed Samuel toward the west field. They walked through the noon heat, cicadas screaming in the trees. Thomas noted that Samuel was walking slightly ahead, which was unusual. Enslaved people typically walked behind or beside whites, never in front. A minor transgression, not worth addressing. They reached the tree line at the field's edge. "Just through here, sir," Samuel said, pointing into the shadows. Thomas stepped between the trees. The hunting knife entered his back just below the left shoulder blade, angled upward toward the heart. He tried to turn, but Marcus was already there with the pistol, and the second blow came from the opposite side. Dinah with a wooden mallet from the equipment shed, striking his temple with force that cracked bone. Thomas Garrett fell without understanding what was happening. His last coherent thought was confusion about the mathematics of this moment. How 3 people had moved with such precision, where they'd gotten weapons, why his system had failed to account for this variable. He tried to reach for his notebook, as if recording the error might somehow correct it. The knife struck again, then 6 more times, until Thomas Garrett stopped moving and the red Carolina clay began darkening with blood that would soon attract flies. No one screamed. No alarm was raised. The killing happened in silence, efficiently, with the same mechanical precision Thomas had demanded from every task on the plantation, and the 3 killers emerged from the trees and walked back toward the main field. By the time they arrived, the 30-minute rest period had ended and work had resumed. 64 people picked cotton in neat rows, their movements synchronized, their focus on the bowls in their hands. 4 others prepared the pike. The pike was a fence post taken from the eastern boundary, sharpened to a point using the tools from Thomas's own equipment shed. They chose a spot where the main road crossed Bellwood's property line, visible from both directions, impossible to miss. The post went into the ground at a slight angle, braced with stones so it would hold weight without toppling. Samuel and 2 other men, Abel and Joshua, chosen for their strength and their discretion, carried Thomas Garrett's body from the tree line to the road. They'd removed his head with the hunting knife, an act that required more effort than any of them had anticipated. Bone was harder than expected. The knife dulled. Marcus had to resharpen it twice before the separation was complete. They worked quickly but without panic. 3 others stood watch on the road, ready to alert if travelers approached. But the road was quiet. It was noon on a Thursday, most people occupied with their own harvest work. The Hutchins property to the west had no view of Bellwood's road frontage. The nearest house to the south was 2 miles away. The head went onto the pike at 12:38 p.m. They positioned it facing the main house, so Thomas Garrett's dead eyes looked toward the white columned structure where his wife and children were eating lunch. The body they dragged into the cotton field and left in a row, arms spread, soaking into the ground where Parthena had collapsed 3 days earlier. Then they returned to work. By 1 p.m., every person in Bellwood's quarters was in the fields, picking cotton, moving between rows, filling baskets with the systematic efficiency Thomas Garrett had drilled into them. When the afternoon overseer inspection didn't happen, no one commented on it. When the 6 p.m. bell rang and Thomas didn't appear to supervise the return to quarters, people simply made their own way back, stored their tools, and began evening tasks. Dinah was preparing cornmeal mush when Catherine Garrett's housemaid, a young woman named Louisa who worked in the main house, came running into the quarters. "He's dead," Louisa gasped, On the road. His head. She couldn't finish the sentence. What are you talking about? Dinah asked calmly. The overseer. Someone killed him. His head is on a spike on the road. People emerged from their cabins. Questions were asked, answered. Who saw it? When? How did it happen? The questions were genuine. Most people in the quarters truly didn't know the details, and the few who did asked with the same confusion as everyone else. Within 10 minutes, the entire quarters population was gathered in the yard, and someone, Abel, who'd helped carry the body, said what? Everyone was thinking, we need to tell the mistress. She already knows, Louisa said. She saw it from the upstairs window. She's packing. She's leaving. In the main house, Catherine Garrett was indeed packing, her hands shaking so badly that her older daughter, Mary, age 11, had taken over the task, while Catherine sat on her bed and tried to remember how to breathe. She'd seen the Pike from the upstairs window while reading to her younger daughter, Alice, age 8. She'd seen Thomas's head, recognized it despite the distance, and understood immediately that the order she'd lived within for 6 years had shattered completely. Her first instinct was to run to the quarters, demand answers, exercise her authority as plantation mistress. But that instinct died before it reached her feet, because she understood with sudden clarity that she had no authority, not anymore. Her husband's head on a spike was a statement that power had shifted, and Catherine had enough survival instinct to recognize when she'd lost. She sent Louisa to the quarters not to demand answers, but to confirm that Catherine and her daughters would be leaving within the hour. She didn't ask permission, she simply stated fact. Then she had Mary pack 2 trunks with clothes and documents while she went to Thomas's office in the overseer's house, moving quickly, not looking at the empty desk drawer, and retrieved the plantation's bank documents and the official ledger. The letters were still gone. Let them be gone. Let whoever took them do whatever they wanted with them. By 3 p.m., Catherine had loaded a wagon with her trunks, her daughters, and enough supplies for a 2-day journey. The horse was hitched by Abel, who worked in silence and wouldn't meet her eyes. She climbed onto the driver's bench, took the reins, and drove toward the main road. She had to pass the Pike. She kept her eyes forward, told her daughters to do the same, and drove past her husband's displayed head without stopping. Behind her, Bellwood Plantation's 200 acres of cotton stood ready for harvest, and 67 people watched the wagon disappear into afternoon heat shimmer. No one followed. No one stopped her. She was simply allowed to leave, which was somehow more terrifying than if they'd prevented her departure. Catherine drove straight to Bennettsville, went directly to Sheriff Tatum's office, and reported that her husband had been murdered by the enslaved population of Bellwood Plantation. The sheriff assembled a militia of 12 men and rode toward Bellwood as the sun set on August 13th. They found the Pike exactly where Catherine described it. They found Thomas Garrett's body in the cotton field. They found all 67 enslaved people in their quarters, preparing evening meals, going about routine tasks as if nothing had happened. When Tatum asked who killed the overseer, every single person denied knowledge. When he threatened mass punishment, everyone remained silent. When he demanded to know where the weapons came from, no one answered. The sheriff stood in Bellwood's quarters as darkness fell and realized he was facing something he had no procedure for addressing. A perfect crime, executed by an entire community. Sheriff William Tatum had maintained order in Marlborough County for 16 years through a combination of personal authority and systemic support. He understood how power worked in rural South Carolina. White men commanded, black people obeyed, and the law enforced this arrangement through threat of overwhelming violence. The system had always been simple. Bellwood Plantation destroyed that simplicity. Tatum's militia arrived at 6:20 p.m. on August 13th, 12 men on horseback armed with rifles and revolvers. They found the Pike first, just as Catherine had described. Thomas Garrett's head mounted on a fence post, positioned so it faced both the road and the main house. The flies had already found it. The August heat had begun its work. Tatum ordered 2 men to take it down and wrap it in canvas. They found the body next, in the cotton field where it had been dragged. Thomas had been stabbed multiple times. Tatum counted 9 wounds, 3 of which would have been individually fatal. The decapitation had been performed post-mortem, which suggested planning rather than frenzy. This wasn't random violence. This was execution. The sheriff rode to the quarters with his militia behind him, a show of force designed to intimidate. 67 people stood in the common yard, assembled by some unspoken agreement, waiting. Tatum studied them. Men, women, children, old and young, field hands and house servants, a complete cross-section of Bellwood's enslaved population, all gathered as if for a meeting. "I'm Sheriff Tatum," he announced from horseback, his voice carrying across the yard. "Thomas Garrett has been murdered. I'm here to find out who did it." Silence. "I'll ask once more. Who killed the overseer?" More silence. Not defiant. That would have been easier to address. This silence was simply complete, a wall of nothing that absorbed questions without returning answers. Tatum dismounted. He walked to the nearest man, Samuel, though he didn't know the name, and stood close enough that intimidation should have worked. "You, where were you at midday?" "In the field, sir." "Doing what?" "Picking cotton, sir." "Did you see anything unusual?" "No, sir." "Did you hear anything unusual?" "No, sir." "You're lying." "No, sir." Samuel's face remained neutral, his voice steady. He wasn't performing innocence or guilt. He was simply giving nothing. Tatum moved to the next person, a woman holding a child. "What about you?" "I was in the field, sir, picking cotton." "Did you see the overseer at midday?" "No, sir." "When did you last see him?" "This morning, sir, during the 5 a.m. bell." "And you noticed nothing unusual all day?" "No, sir." The pattern repeated. Tatum questioned 15 people and received 15 variations of the same response. Everyone had been in the fields. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The overseer was present in the morning and absent by evening, and the space between contained only cotton picking and routine labor. One of the militia members, a young farmer named Jessup, spoke up. "Sheriff, they're all lying. They had to have seen something. Someone here killed him." "I know that," Tatum said. "The question is how to prove which someone." He tried another approach. He ordered the entire population to show him their hands, looking for cuts, bruises, blood traces. He found calluses, scars from old whip wounds, the routine damage of agricultural labor. Nothing fresh. Nothing that clearly indicated recent violence. He searched the cabins. He found cooking equipment, bedding, the minimal possessions allowed to enslaved people. In one cabin, Marcus and Dinah's, he found a small leather-bound book with handwritten entries. He opened it, expecting a diary, and found instead a record of Parthena's life. Her birth year, unknown but estimated. Her children's names, stories about her childhood before enslavement. A memorial, not evidence. By 8 p.m., Tatum had spent 2 hours questioning and searching without producing a single useful lead. His militia was growing restless. The enslaved population remained silent, cooperative in manner but utterly unhelpful in substance. "What do we do?" Jessup asked quietly. "Hang them all? Make an example?" Tatum considered it. Mass execution would send a message. It would demonstrate that this kind of action couldn't stand. But it would also destroy approximately $40,000 in property value, Catherine Garrett's property, though she'd fled, and create wider problems. Neighboring plantations would be terrified. Enslaved people across the county would see that cooperation led to death and might decide they had nothing to lose. The mathematics of terror worked both ways. "We take 3, Tatum decided. 3 of the strongest men. We hold them for trial and let the judge decide." He selected Samuel, Abel, and Marcus, the 3 who'd been least convincing in their denials, though all had maintained the same story as everyone else. He had his men bind their hands and prepare to transport them to Bennettsville's jail. As the militia prepared to leave, Dinah stepped forward. "Sheriff?" Tatum turned. "What?" "What about the cotton? Who's supposed to harvest it?" The question was so unexpected that Tatum actually paused to consider it. Bellwood's fields held approximately 70,000 pounds of unpicked cotton, worth perhaps $14,000 at current Confederate prices. If it rotted in the fields, that value disappeared. "That's Mrs. Garrett's concern," he said finally. "Is she coming back?" "I don't know." "Then who's in charge?" Tatum didn't have an answer. The legal situation was unprecedented. A plantation abandoned by its small white owners, its enslaved population, left in a kind of limbo. Were they still property? If so, whose responsibility were they? If Catherine never returned, what happened to them? "For now you maintain the property," Tatum said. "Continue normal operations. Someone will be appointed to oversee you until Mrs. Garrett's situation is resolved." "Yes, sir," Dinah said. The militia left with their 3 prisoners as darkness covered Bellwood Plantation. Behind them, 64 people returned to their cabins, and somewhere in the quarters, someone began singing. Not a work song, not a hymn, but something older, something that had no words in English, only rhythm and tone that carried meaning the sheriff would never understand. The 3 arrested men were held in Bennettsville's jail overnight. The next morning, August 14th, the Pike was gone from the roadside. Someone had taken it down while the town slept, and no one admitted to seeing who or when. That same morning, travelers on the road past Bellwood began reporting what they'd seen. By noon, the story had spread through Marlborough County and into neighboring districts. By nightfall, it had reached Columbia. Within 3 days, it would appear in Charleston newspapers, stripped of names but heavy with implications. Overseer murdered by slave conspiracy, family flees, plantation abandoned, authorities investigating. What the newspapers didn't report was simpler and more disturbing. The system had failed, not gradually, not through some complex breakdown, but suddenly and completely. One man's head on a pike had demonstrated what everyone involved in slavery always knew but rarely acknowledged, that the entire structure rested on collective acceptance of its violence. And when that acceptance shattered, when people decided that death was preferable to continued submission, the machinery of control simply stopped working. Sheriff Tatum understood this as he read the newspaper accounts. He'd arrested 3 men, but he knew they weren't the only ones responsible. He knew the entire community had participated, if only through silence. He knew that proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt would be impossible. And he knew that what happened at Bellwood could happen anywhere. The Marlborough County Court met in a 2-story brick building in Bennettsville's town square. Constructed in 1853, during a period of relative prosperity. The courtroom occupied the second floor. Oak benches, a judge's elevated desk, windows that let in morning light, but could be shuttered against afternoon heat. By August of 1863, the court was functioning sporadically. The Confederate war effort had claimed judges, lawyers, and clerks. Many cases were delayed indefinitely. The murder of Thomas Garrett moved to the top of the docket. Judge Thaddeus Crane was 68, a plantation owner himself with 92 enslaved people working his property 12 miles north of town. He'd served on the bench for 23 years and understood that this case represented something larger than individual guilt. It represented the county's ability to maintain order during wartime chaos. The trial began on August 20th, 1 week after Thomas Garrett's death. Samuel, Abel, and Marcus were brought from the jail in chains, walked through town in full view of residents who lined the streets to watch. The spectacle was deliberate, a demonstration that authority persisted despite the shocking events at Bellwood. There was no lawyer for the defense. Confederate South Carolina didn't provide counsel for enslaved people accused of crimes. The prosecution was handled by District Solicitor Martin Grayson, no relation to the Robert Grayson of neighboring plantations, who laid out the case in his opening statement. "The evidence is simple," Grayson told the jury of 12 white men. Thomas Garrett was murdered in the middle of the day on property where these 3 men worked. His head was severed and displayed. His body was left in the fields. These 3 were seen acting suspiciously. One of them, he pointed at Samuel, was the last person to speak with Mr. Garrett before his death, claiming there was equipment that needed inspection. When the sheriff arrived, all 3 gave evasive answers. Their guilt is clear. Judge Crane allowed the defendants to speak on their own behalf. Samuel went first. "I worked in Bellwood's fields for 16 years, he said, his voice steady. "I did what the overseer told me. On August 13th, I told Mr. Garrett about a wagon problem because there was a wagon problem. The axle was cracked. I didn't kill him. I was in the fields all day. At least 40 people can confirm that." "Can they?" Judge Crane asked. "Because Sheriff Tatum reports that everyone at Bellwood gave the same story. Conveniently, you all claim to have been together, providing each other alibis." "We were together, Your Honor. We worked together. It's a plantation." The judge let Abel speak next. His statement was simpler. "I didn't kill the overseer. I was picking cotton all day. I didn't see nothing." Marcus spoke last, and his testimony differed in one crucial way. "My grandmother died 3 days before Mr. Garrett was killed. She died because he worked her past exhaustion and wouldn't let her rest. So yes, I hated him. But I didn't kill him. If I had, I wouldn't lie about it." The courtroom went quiet. Judge Crane leaned forward. "You're saying if you'd murdered the overseer, you'd admit it? I'm saying that if I'd killed the man who killed my grandmother, I'd be proud enough of it to claim the action. But I didn't kill him. Someone else did." "Who?" "I don't know." The prosecution called one witness, Catherine Garrett. She entered the courtroom in full mourning dress, accompanied by her brother, who'd arrived from Charleston to support her. She testified for 30 minutes, describing the efficient, orderly plantation her husband had managed, the shocking discovery of his murder, the terror that had driven her to flee. "Did any of these 3 men ever threaten your husband?" Grayson asked. "Not directly, but Thomas mentioned several times that the one called Samuel watched him constantly. He found it unsettling." "Did he consider Samuel dangerous?" "He considered all of them potentially dangerous. That's why he maintained such strict discipline." The prosecution rested. There was no defense presentation because there was no defense attorney. Judge Crane asked the defendants if they had anything to add. All three declined. The jury deliberated for 14 minutes. They returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts for all three defendants. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 7 days. Judge Crane scheduled the execution for August 27th at noon in Bennettsville's town square, where everyone in the county could witness that justice had been served and order maintained. But that night, something happened that would delay the execution indefinitely. The letters arrived at Judge Crane's home at 8 p.m. on August the 20th, the same day the guilty verdict was delivered. They were left on his porch in a canvas sack, addressed in crude handwriting to Judge Crane, urgent. His house servant, an elderly man named Thomas, a different Thomas, brought them inside and handed them to the judge in his study. Crane opened the sack and found 37 letters, all in the same handwriting, all signed by Thomas Garrett. He began reading. The first letter was dated October 11th, 1859. It began, "My dear cousin James, I write to explain my methods since you expressed concern about severity." The letter detailed Thomas Garrett's philosophy of enslaved labor management, including specific punishments for specific infractions. It described productivity calculations based on pain tolerance. It explained how to break resistance without permanently damaging property value. The second letter, dated March 3rd, 1860, was addressed to Catherine's late father. "Dear Mr. Bellwood, I want you to understand why I must maintain distance from sentiment." This one described Thomas's decision to separate families when it improved work output, his system for selective breeding, his belief that affection between enslaved people created inefficiency. Crane read 3 more letters before setting them aside and walking to his window. He stood in darkness, watching his own plantation's quarters where lamplight flickered in cabin windows, and understood that he was holding dynamite. These letters, if published, would become ammunition for abolitionists. They provided detailed first-person testimony of slavery's brutality, written by a plantation overseer, containing specific incidents that could be verified. Even in the Confederacy, even among people who accepted slavery as natural, these letters would disturb. They were too systematic, too cold, too explicit in their calculation of suffering. More immediately, they complicated the trial, because if these letters were authentic, and Crane recognized the handwriting from documents Thomas Garrett had filed with the county clerk, then they provided motive. They documented that Thomas had been systematically brutal, that his death might have been provoked response rather than unprovoked rebellion. The law didn't excuse enslaved people who killed whites, even in self-defense. But juries were made of humans, and humans could be swayed by circumstances. These letters created circumstances that complicated the clean narrative of 3 guilty men receiving deserved punishment. Crane read through the night. By dawn, he'd finished all 37 letters and made a decision. He sent a messenger to Sheriff Tatum requesting an immediate meeting. At 7 a.m., the 2 men sat in Crane's study with the letters spread across the desk. "Where did they come from?" Tatum asked. "They were left on my porch. No indication who delivered them." "Someone from Bellwood." "Obviously. Why now? Why not before the trial?" Crane considered. "Because before the trial, they might have prevented convictions. After the trial, they create a different kind of pressure." "What kind?" "The kind that questions whether hanging 3 men for killing a man like this is justice or simply maintenance of order." Tatum picked up one of the letters, scanned it, set it down with distaste. Thomas Garrett was within his rights as an overseer. Nothing in these letters describes illegal activity. Legal and right aren't always the same thing, William. They're the same thing in a courtroom. Are they? Because I have to sleep at night after ordering 3 men hanged, and I'm having difficulty understanding how executing them for killing a man who wrote these things serves justice. The 2 men argued for an hour. Tatum maintained that the law was clear. Enslaved people who killed whites were guilty regardless of provocation. Crane argued that while the law might be clear, its application should account for circumstances. They reached no resolution. That afternoon, Judge Crane did something unprecedented. He ordered a stay of execution pending further review. He didn't cite the letters publicly. Doing so would require introducing them as evidence, which would mean acknowledging their content. Instead, he cited procedural irregularities and ordered a new hearing. The announcement caused immediate confusion. Catherine Garrett's brother, who'd remained in Bennettsville to see justice carried out, went directly to the judge's chambers and demanded explanation. Crane declined to provide one. Sheriff Tatum faced angry questions from militia members and plantation owners who'd attended the trial expecting swift execution. He blamed the judge, said his hands were tied, promised the matter would be resolved soon. In the jail, Samuel, Abel, and Marcus learned that their hanging had been delayed, but received no explanation why. They spent another night in cells, uncertain whether this represented hope or merely postponed death. In Bellwood's quarters, 64 people continued working the plantation, as they had for the past week, bringing in cotton from the eastern fields, maintaining equipment, preparing meals from their own garden plots, and the provisions remaining in Thomas Garrett's locked storehouse. They existed in a strange limbo, legally enslaved but functionally autonomous, waiting for someone to arrive and reimpose order. No one came. Catherine remained in Charleston, unwilling to return. No overseer wanted the position at a plantation where the previous overseer's head had decorated a pike. The Confederate government, overwhelmed by military concerns, had no capacity to address the situation. Bellwood Plantation operated itself, and every night, someone in the quarters sang. On August 25th, 2 days before the originally scheduled execution, Judge Crane received an unexpected visitor. Dinah arrived at his home at 7 p.m., accompanied by Robert Hutchins from the neighboring plantation. Hutchins had brought her in his wagon, a fact that immediately told Crane this meeting had been carefully arranged. "Your Honor," Hutchins said, standing in Crane's parlor with his hat in his hands, "this woman has information about Thomas Garrett's death that I believe you should hear." "Is she confessing?" "No, she's offering context." Crane should have sent them away. Taking informal testimony from an enslaved woman outside the courtroom was highly irregular, but he was intrigued. He dismissed his house servants, closed the parlor doors, and sat down across from Dinah. "Speak," he said. Dinah had prepared for this moment. For 3 days, she and several others in Bellwood's quarters had discussed whether to intervene, whether attempting to save Samuel, Abel, and Marcus was worth the risk of exposing themselves. They'd decided it was, not because the 3 men were innocent, they weren't, but because allowing them to hang alone felt like betrayal. "Your Honor," Dinah began, "you've read letters that explain what Thomas Garrett was like. You know he wasn't a normal overseer. He wasn't even a normal, cruel overseer. He was something else. That's not relevant to the legal question." "Then let me be relevant." Dinah's voice was steady, her words chosen carefully. 3 men are in jail for killing Thomas Garrett, but every person at Bellwood, all 67 of us, wanted him dead. We all had reasons. My mother died because he worked her to exhaustion. Marcus's grandmother died the same way. Samuel's wife was sold away 5 years ago because Thomas decided separating families improved productivity. We all suffered under his system. None of that justifies murder. No, Your Honor, but it explains it. And here's what I came to tell you. Samuel, Abel, and Marcus didn't kill Thomas Garrett. Crane sat forward. Then who did? I did. The room went silent. Hutchins, standing by the door, looked shocked. Crane studied Dinah's face, searching for deception. You're confessing? I'm telling you that I stabbed Thomas Garrett with his own hunting knife in the tree line of Bellwood's West Field on August 13th at approximately 12:30 p.m. Marcus and Samuel helped me move the body and prepare the pike. Abel helped raise it. But the killing itself, that was me. Why are you confessing now? Because you know those 3 men didn't act alone. You know the entire plantation was involved. And if you hang them, you know you'll be executing 3 people for something that dozens of us participated in. That's not justice. That's selection. Crane stood, paced to the window, stood with his back to her. If I believe your confession, I'd have to arrest you, try you, and hang you. Yes, Your Honor. And you're willing to accept that to save 3 men? I'm willing to tell the truth. What you do with it is your decision. The judge turned. Here's the truth as I understand it. Thomas Garrett was killed by a conspiracy involving most or all of Bellwood's enslaved population. The 3 men in custody participated, but weren't solely responsible. You also participated. Probably dozens of others did too. And I cannot execute an entire plantation. No, sir. So what would you have me do? Release everyone? Set a precedent that murdering whites is acceptable if enough people cooperate? This was the moment Dinah had prepared for. I'd have you consider that Thomas Garrett created conditions that made his own death inevitable. I'd have you recognize that we exist in a system that gives us no legal recourse against brutality. And I'd have you decide whether hanging 3 men, or 4, if you include me, actually serves order, or whether it just creates martyrs. Are you threatening more violence? No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting that the execution will create problems worse than the stay of execution you've already ordered. Crane walked to his desk, sat heavily. Why did Robert Hutchins bring you here? Because I asked him to. Because he's the only white person in this county who saw what was happening at Bellwood and tried to stop it. He came to Sheriff Tatum before Thomas died, told him something needed to change. The sheriff did nothing, so I thought maybe he'd be willing to help us now. Crane looked at Hutchins. Is that true? Yes, Hutchins said quietly. I went to William 3 days before Thomas was killed. I told him conditions at Bellwood were creating a dangerous situation. He dismissed my concerns. Did you hear plans for violence? No, but I heard desperation. The 3 of them sat in the parlor for another hour, not negotiating exactly. Dinah had no position to negotiate from, but discussing. Crane asked questions about Bellwood's operations, about Thomas's methods, about the days leading up to his death. Dinah answered honestly, though she carefully avoided implicating specific people beyond herself and the 3 already in custody. Finally, Crane made a decision. I'm not going to arrest you for your confession. I'm also not going to release the 3 men in custody. Instead, I'm going to delay the execution indefinitely while I determine if there's a legal framework for addressing this situation that doesn't require mass hangings. And Bellwood? Dinah asked. What happens to us? For now, you continue as you have been. The plantation is effectively under your management until Mrs. Garrett returns or sells the property, which means you're responsible for maintaining order, bringing in the harvest, and ensuring no further violence occurs. We can do that. I know you can. That's what concerns me. Hutchins drove Dinah back to Bellwood in darkness. They didn't speak during the journey. When they reached the plantation boundary, Dinah climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the quarters, where lamplight showed people still awake, waiting for her return. The next morning, Judge Crane drafted a letter to the Confederate District Court in Columbia, outlining the Bellwood situation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. The letter would take 3 weeks to receive a response, by which time circumstances would have changed in ways that made the legal question moot. But that night, 3 men in Bennettsville's jail learned that their execution had been stayed indefinitely. They didn't know why, didn't know that Dinah had confessed in their place, didn't know that the judge was struggling with questions that had no good answers. They simply knew they were still alive, and that was enough. September arrived with cooler temperatures and new complications. The cotton harvest at Bellwood Plantation was nearly complete. 64 people working with extraordinary efficiency had brought in most of the crop by month's end. Without Thomas Garrett's careful calculations of optimal work hours, they worked sunrise to sunset. Not because an overseer demanded it, but because they understood the cotton represented value that might be converted to something useful. But converted by whom? For whose benefit? The legal situation remained unresolved. Judge Crane's letter to Columbia had received no response. Catherine Garrett remained in Charleston, refusing to return or sell. The 3 men in jail remained in custody, their executions delayed indefinitely. Bellwood existed in limbo, a plantation without white ownership, its enslaved population functioning autonomously while technically still bound by laws that no longer had anyone present to enforce them. Other plantations watched nervously. If Bellwood's people could effectively emancipate themselves through violence and subsequent abandonment, what stopped others from trying? Sheriff Tatum increased patrols. Plantation owners instituted stricter controls on their own properties. The fear was palpable. Then, in mid-September, 2 events occurred that changed everything. First, Confederate forces suffered major defeats at Chickamauga and Chattanooga. The war, which many Southerners had believed would end in Confederate victory, now looked increasingly likely to result in Union triumph. Slavery's future, regardless of individual plantation situations, was becoming uncertain. Second, Catherine Garrett sold Bellwood Plantation. She negotiated the sale through intermediaries, never returning to the property herself. The buyer was a Charleston merchant named William Preston, who specialized in acquiring distressed properties and reselling them at profit. Preston paid 70 cents on the dollar for a plantation that should have been worth significantly more, but Catherine accepted because she wanted nothing further to do with the place where her husband had died. Preston arrived at Bellwood on September 22nd with 2 hired overseers and a clear plan: reassert control, discipline the workforce, restore proper order. He would demonstrate that what had happened to Thomas Garrett was an aberration, not a new normal. He was wrong. Preston's wagon rolled into Bellwood at 10 a.m. He found the fields empty, unusual since it was a workday. He found the quarters populated with everyone, men, women, children, standing in the common yard as if they'd been expecting him. Dinah stepped forward. "Mr. Preston? Who are you?" "Dinah. I've been managing operations since Mr. Garrett's death." "Well, that ends now. I'm the new owner. You and everyone else will report to my overseers tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. for work assignments." No, sir. The word hung in the September air. Preston's two overseers moved their hands to their belts, where pistols were holstered. But they were two men facing 64 people, and the mathematics weren't favorable. What did you say? Preston asked carefully. We won't be reporting to your overseers. We won't be working your fields. We're leaving. You can't leave. You're enslaved. Your property I just purchased. You purchased land and buildings. You didn't purchase us because we were never for sale. We've been free since August 13th. We've been running this plantation ourselves for 5 weeks, and now we're done. Preston looked around the assembled people. He saw unity. He saw determination. He saw what Thomas Garrett had failed to see until the moment a knife entered his back. That consent, even coerced consent, was essential to the system's function. And when consent was withdrawn completely, no amount of force could substitute. If you leave, you'll be hunted as runaways. The law allows it. Then the law will need to catch us. Where will you go? North. Preston tried to argue. He cited legal precedents, property rights, the Fugitive Slave Act. But his words evaporated against the simple fact that no one was listening. After 30 minutes, he left, returning to Charleston to inform authorities that Bellwood Plantation's entire, enslaved population had declared themselves free and planned to flee. Sheriff Tatum arrived the next day with his militia. They found Bellwood abandoned. The quarters were empty, the fields unharvested, the buildings locked. 64 people had left during the night, moving north through pine forests and swamps, following routes that had been planned for weeks. Some were caught over the following months. Slave catchers and Confederate patrols found small groups and returned them to slavery. But most made it, to Union lines in Tennessee, to free territories, to places where the Confederacy's laws couldn't reach. Dinah and Marcus were among those who succeeded, eventually reaching Ohio and settling in a free black community outside Cincinnati. Samuel, Abel, and the third man arrested remained in jail until January of 1864, when Judge Crane, recognizing that the legal situation had become untenable, simply released them with a warning never to return to Marlborough County. They followed the routes north that others had taken. Bellwood Plantation stood empty through the winter of 1863-64. Preston tried to sell it, but found no buyers. The property's reputation made it impossible to staff. Eventually, it was abandoned completely. Thomas Garrett's head was never found after someone removed it from the Pike that first night. Legend says it was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on Bellwood's property, but searches over the years found nothing. The 300 acres of cotton land returned to forest over the next decade. The Civil War ended in April of 1865. 20 months after Thomas Garrett's head appeared on that pike. The Confederacy surrendered. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. What had been illegal in August of 1863, enslaved people declaring themselves free and fleeing north, became retroactively legitimate. For those who'd fled Bellwood, this meant legal protection. Dinah and Marcus, living in Ohio, could now travel without fear of slave catchers. Samuel worked as a carpenter in Pennsylvania. Abel became a dock worker in Philadelphia. They built lives that would have been impossible under the system that Thomas Garrett had enforced so efficiently. Catherine Garrett never recovered financially or emotionally from what happened at Bellwood. She lived with her brother's family in Charleston, dependent on his charity, for the rest of her life. Her daughters grew up knowing their father had been killed by enslaved people, but not knowing why, not understanding the system that had created conditions for his death. Catherine died in 1883, leaving nothing but debts and a few letters documenting her version of events. Letters that painted Thomas as a martyred victim and the enslaved population as savages. Those letters were donated to the Charleston Historical Society and spent a century in archives, consulted occasionally by researchers studying plantation management. Judge Crane retired from the bench in 1867, troubled by questions the Bellwood case had raised. He'd spent 40 years enforcing laws that treated people as property, and Thomas Garrett's letters, which he'd kept locked in his desk, demonstrated where that logic inevitably led. In his private papers, discovered after his death, he'd written, "I cannot reconcile the law I enforced with the justice I believed I served." Sheriff Tatum served through Reconstruction and into the 1870s, maintaining order through successive political transformations. He never spoke publicly about Bellwood, but he kept a file of newspaper clippings about the case, including articles from northern papers that treated Thomas Garrett's death as evidence of slavery's inherent violence and volatility. Robert Hutchins, the neighbor who'd tried to warn authorities and later helped Dinah reach Judge Crane, freed all 23 people he'd enslaved in April of 1865, as soon as the war ended. He divided his property among them, creating small farms that several families worked successfully for decades. In an 1870 interview with a northern journalist researching Reconstruction, Hutchins said, "I saw what happened when a man pushed too hard. I decided I'd rather have neighbors than property." The physical site of Bellwood Plantation deteriorated rapidly. Preston sold it at a significant loss in 1867 to a timber company that clear-cut the pine forests and abandoned the cleared land. The main house burned in 1872 under mysterious circumstances. Local rumor suggested arson, though no one was charged. The overseer's house where Thomas had lived collapsed in the 1880s. By 1900, nothing remained but foundations and the faint traces of old field boundaries. But the story persisted. In 1923, a folklorist from the University of South Carolina visited Marlborough County, collecting stories about the antebellum period and Reconstruction. She interviewed elderly residents, both black and white, and recorded versions of what had happened at Bellwood Plantation 60 years earlier. The white residents remembered it as a tragedy. A good overseer murdered by ungrateful slaves, a system breaking down, chaos that had required firm response. They remembered the trial, the guilty verdict, and felt frustrated that executions had never occurred. They saw Bellwood's abandonment as evidence that slavery's end had been premature, that some people weren't ready for freedom. The black residents remembered it differently. They remembered Thomas Garrett as exceptionally cruel, even by the standards of a brutal system. They remembered August 13th, 1863, not as tragedy, but as rupture, a moment when people said enough and made it stick. They remembered the Pike as a warning: push too hard, and systems break. The folklorist collected 37 distinct versions of the story, no two identical. Some said Thomas Garrett's head was found and buried. Others said it was never recovered, that it remained somewhere on the property, a permanent reminder of what happened when power was exercised without limit. Some said 3 men killed him. Others said it was a woman. A few said it was the entire community acting together. All agreed that the killing had been planned, systematic, and effective. The folklorist published her findings in a 1925 academic journal that few people read. The article included careful analysis of how oral traditions preserved and distorted historical events, how communities created narratives that served their needs, how memory and myth intertwined. She missed the point entirely. The story wasn't interesting because it documented what actually happened. Courthouse records and newspaper archives already did that. The story was interesting because it persisted, because people kept telling it, because it meant something beyond its historical specifics. In 1967, during the Civil Rights Movement, a group of activists in South Carolina referenced the Bellwood story during a speech about resistance to oppression. They held up the example of people who'd overthrown their overseer and freed themselves before emancipation officially arrived. The story gained new circulation, became shorthand for the principle that change sometimes required confrontation, that systems built on violence eventually generated their own opposition. In 2008, a historical marker was proposed for the site of Bellwood Plantation. It would have noted the property's existence, its abandonment, and the controversial events of August 1863. Local white residents objected, saying the marker would glorify violence. Local black residents objected, saying the proposed text whitewashed what had actually occurred. The marker was never erected. In 2019, a metal detecting enthusiast searching the area where Bellwood had stood found an iron pike point buried 18 inches underground. Tests suggested it dated to the mid-19th century. The finder donated it to the Marlborough County Historical Society, where it sits in a storage room, cataloged but not displayed, because no one can agree on how to present it. Every few years, someone proposes a documentary about Bellwood. The proposals never advance beyond early development, because the story resists clean narrative. There's no trial transcript. The original records were lost or destroyed. There's no definitive account of who did what. There are only fragments, newspaper clippings, courthouse documents, letters, oral histories that contradict each other in significant ways. But the fundamental facts persist. Thomas Garrett was killed. His head was displayed on a pike. His family fled. The plantation was abandoned. Enslaved people freed themselves months before legal emancipation. And the system that should have caught them, tried them, and executed them simply failed to function when confronted with complete non-cooperation. Those facts matter because they demonstrate something that makes people uncomfortable regardless of their political orientation. That power is more fragile than it appears. That systems require participation, and that when people collectively decide to stop participating, the machinery of control simply stops. Bellwood Plantation's exact location is now difficult to determine. The timber clear-cutting, subsequent farming, and modern development have erased the physical landscape. Old property records provide general boundaries, but the specific location where Thomas Garrett died, where his head was displayed, where 64 people made themselves free through collective action, all of that is lost. What remains is story. In Marlborough County, some families still pass down accounts of what happened in August of 1863. The details shift, names change, motivations get simplified. The pike moves from one location to another, but the core remains. One elderly resident, interviewed in 2015, summed it up. "My grandmother's grandmother was there. She said the overseer got what he earned, and the people who killed him walked away free. Said it was the only time she ever saw the system fail completely. Just stop working when people stopped cooperating with their own oppression." The interviewer asked if that was true. "Does it matter?" The resident replied. "The story's true even if the details aren't perfect. And maybe that's the point. Bellwood Plantation existed. Thomas Garrett was killed. The system broke down. And somewhere in the woods that now cover those 300 acres, history left a marker that can't be found on any map or placed in any museum. The memory that power has limits, that cruelty generates resistance, and that sometimes resistance wins. even if only briefly, even if only once, even if the winning itself becomes legend. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.